this why question often is asked by armchair philosophers. And some of us may even have asked the question that way at times in our life, but no one's asking the question in that way right now. That why is being asked with real emotion, and for many people, even with desperation. I always try to remember that the first conversation I ever had about suffering, after I had become a Christian in my college years, it was with my Aunt Regina. And she spoke with me about some serious suffering in her life and in the life of her son, my cousin, Charles. And after I listened to her speak about this, at the time, I was more interested in the question, the philosophical question, than the questioner. And I quickly began spouting some of my philosophical explanations for why God might allow Charles to have suffered. And my Aunt Regina listened very graciously to me. And then at the end, she said, "But Vince, that doesn't speak to me as a mother." And I've always tried to remember that line when trying to respond to this type of question. Jesus was much better than I was at remembering that sentiment. When his good friend Lazarus was ill, Jesus waited a couple of days before he went to see him, and Lazarus wound up dying before Jesus got there. And reading between the lines in the passage, Mary and Martha were not too impressed, Lazarus' sisters, and they said, "Jesus, why didn't you come sooner? If you had been here, our brother would still be alive. What do you have to say for yourself?" And as a Christian, I believe at that time, Jesus could have given an explanation, but he didn't. The text says that Jesus wept. It's the shortest verse in the Bible, and it's very important to me as a Christian that first and foremost, God weeps at the suffering of this world, and that has to be our first response as well. I'll say a couple of other things, but please hear me at the outset to say this is not in any way meant to be an exhaustive answer to this question. I do think it's interesting when we talk about something like the coronavirus. In philosophy, it would be referred to as natural evil. And that in itself is an interesting terminology. You might think it's an oxymoron. You might think if it's genuinely natural, if it's just the way it's supposed to be, if it's just the way that physics is supposed to operate, well then, is it actually evil? Can you get a moral category like evil out of something which is just physical and natural? And if it's evil, then is it really natural? If it's genuinely evil, wouldn't that make it unnatural and not natural? So it's an interesting terminology. I find myself wondering if actually that classification, if it points towards God rather than away from God. If it points towards a moral lawgiver who can be the ground of a moral standard of moral reality that can get us a category like moral evil, and also towards a narrative that makes some sense of the fact that this seems very unnatural. This does not seem like it's the way things are supposed to be. Another perspective that I'd want to open up here is that, natural evils, they're not intrinsically evil in and of themselves. If you have a tornado and you are watching it from a safe distance, it can be majestic to behold. It could be beautiful to behold. If you put a virus under a microscope, it could be beautiful to behold. And there's even a category of viruses, friendly viruses. We need them in our body. The vast majority of viruses are not having a bad result, they're having a good result. And in fact, if we didn't have viruses in the world, bacteria would replicate so quickly that it would cover the entire earth and nothing could inhabit the earth, including us. It raises the question, is the problem the fundamental natural features of our universe, or is the problem the way that we are functioning in our environment? Could it be the case that we're not functioning, our bodies, the way we're supposed to in the environment that we're in? When a feral child is taken out of all community, out of all relationship that child was intended for, the child does not function properly in its environment. Could it be the case that we, as humanity, as a whole, are living separated from, outside the context of the relationship that we were most destined for, and we're not operating properly in our environment? There's so much more to say about this topic. I'll open up one more angle just for your consideration. Oftentimes when we think of suffering, we think about it like this. We picture ourselves in this world with all of its suffering. We then picture ourselves in a very different world, with no suffering or far less suffering, and then we wonder to ourselves, well, surely God should have made me in the other world. Reasonable thought, but potentially problematic, because we never ask the question, would it still be you and me and the people that we love in that very different world that we think we wish God had made? In a moment of frustration with my father, this would never actually happen, Dad, but in a moment of frustration with my father, I might wish that my mom had married someone else. Might have been taller like Abdu, might have been better looking like Abdu. I would have been better off. I could be thinking this way, but then I should stop and realize that's not the right way to think. If my mom had wound up with someone other than my dad, it wouldn't have been me who came to exist. It would have been a totally different child who came to exist. Well, now imagine changing not just that little piece of history, but imagine changing the way the entire natural world operates. Imagine if we were never susceptible to disease, or imagine if plate tectonics didn't behave the way they did, if the laws of physics had undergone a redesign. What would be the result? And I think one of the results is that none of us ever would have lived. And as a Christian, I don't think God likes that result, because I think one of the things he values about this world, even though I think he hates the suffering within it, is that it is a world that allowed for you to come to exist, and allowed for me to come to exist, and allowed for every person we see walking down the street to come to exist. I believe that God intended you before the foundation of the world, that he knit you together in your mother's womb, that he knew you before you were born. He desired you, and this was a world that allowed for you to come to exist and to be invited into a relationship with him. Are we going to have all the answers to this question? No, we're not, but I don't think we should expect to. I was thinking this morning about my 1-year-old son, Raphael, and he generally does not understand why sometimes I allow him to suffer. And I was thinking specifically of one instance where they had to do some tests on his heart, and I was there holding him down while he shrieked in horror with all these wires coming out from his chest as they did these tests. He couldn't understand. He couldn't understand that I was loving him through that moment. And all I could do as a father was I just kept saying, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. I just kept saying that repetitively. Ultimately, the reason that I trust God through something like the coronavirus is not because of philosophy, but because I believe the Christian God came and he suffered with us. I believe that in the person of Jesus, that is God's way of saying, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. And as the words of Jesus himself, here I am, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with him and he with me. That's the hope that we have, the hope of a beautiful intimacy that can be everlasting, and it's a hope I believe we need to hold on to in this time.